Have you ever wondered why no one ever told you this part of the story? Why is it that in every war documentary, the images are always the same? Tanks, generals, battles, men. But what about the women? The ones who fought with weapons, with codes, with sheer courage. The ones who stood face to face with Hitler and were then silenced by the very history they helped shape. They existed, they resisted, and they were erased. Maybe you've never heard their names, but maybe you're just like them, someone who's always done more than others ever saw, someone who carries strength but was overlooked, someone who fought silent battles and survived. This is the erased truth, the story of the women who stood against the greatest monster of the century and were forgotten because of it, but not anymore. Today we bring their voices back, because the world needs to know these warriors and maybe see a piece of you in each of them. They fought, the world forgot, and now you will remember. Before we go any further, take a breath. If this already touched you, if some part of you felt that pain of being invisible, of doing so much and being remembered for so little, then this story is for you. And if it is, you can't just watch. You need to be part of it, because every time someone subscribes, this story reaches further. Every click is a tribute. Every new subscriber is one more voice saying, "I care, I won't forget." So now, before we continue, click subscribe. Not for numbers, but for memory, for the voices that were erased, and because stories like this deserve to be told to the end. Are you with us? Now we can go on. Have you ever noticed how, when we talk about World War II, we always seem to hear the same voices? Generals with medals, soldiers charging through gunfire, bombers roaring through the skies. Always men, always the same stories. But what about the women? Where were they when the world was burning? Were they just waiting at home, writing letters and praying for husbands at war? No. They were there, in the shadows, at the front lines, behind enemy walls, with pistols tucked into handbags, codes racing through their minds, and courage that would rattle any soldier's bones. But history chose silence. It buried their names in footnotes. It pushed their stories to the edge of memory. This, right now, is where we dig them up. We're not just telling stories. We're opening graves of forgotten bravery. You're going to meet them, one by one. You'll hear their footsteps echoing down cobblestone streets in occupied Paris. You'll feel the freezing wind on their faces as they flew night missions in pitch-black Soviet skies. You'll see blood on their hands, tears in their eyes, and fire in their hearts. This isn't just history, it's justice, and it starts with one woman who vanished behind enemy lines. Her name was Lisa. She disappeared in Paris, and everything begins with her. Her name was Lisa de Baissac. On paper, she was a quiet Frenchwoman with a bicycle and a soft voice. But in reality, she was one of the deadliest ghosts the Nazis never saw coming. She wasn't trained to kill. She wasn't raised for war. But when Europe fell to Hitler's boots, Lisa made a choice. She wouldn't wait for someone else to fight back. She would become the resistance. And so she vanished, not into hiding, but into role. She became someone else entirely. Under the code name Odile, she parachuted into Nazi-occupied France, alone in the dead of night. No backup, no guarantee she'd survive the landing. Just a tiny radio, a cyanide pill, and a mission. By day, she rode through Paris like any other woman, a shadow blending with the crowd. By night, she was a storm, gathering intelligence, mapping German troop movements, setting up safe houses, recruiting fighters. If the Gestapo ever caught her, torture would be the beginning. But she never flinched. There was one rule for SOE agents. Like her, don't get attached. But Lise did. She fell in love with the people she helped, the families who fed her, the couriers who risked everything to carry a message. She stayed longer than she was supposed to, And when the time came to pull her out, she refused. She didn't vanish because she was captured. She vanished because she chose to stay, to keep fighting, to keep saving lives. She survived the war, just barely, but her story, like so many others, got lost in the noise of post-war parades. But not anymore, because tonight you remember her. Lisa, the girl who disappeared in Paris, not in fear, but in defiance. They weren't soldiers. They didn't carry guns. Most people thought they were just secretaries, typing in the background of a war too big for them to touch, but they were the invisible front line. In a quiet English manor called Bletchley Park, behind locked doors and guarded fences, a secret war was being fought, not with bullets, but with minds. And many of those minds belonged to young women barely out of school. One of them was Joan Clark. Joan didn't wear a uniform. She wore wool skirts and modest shoes, but inside her head spun the kind of brilliance that could tear apart a Nazi. Code in hours, the kind of genius that could save convoys from U-boats before the torpedoes even hit the water. She worked side by side with Alan Turing, solving the unthinkable. The German Enigma, a code machine so complex it was said to be unbreakable. Until it wasn't, Joan and the women like her worked in silence. No praise, no medals, just long hours, pounding headaches, and the crushing weight of knowing what they couldn't say, not even to their own families. Every letter they decrypted was a heartbeat, a chance to save a ship, a village, a friend. Every second mattered. They were told it was clerical work. But behind every intercepted transmission, behind every cracked cipher, there was a life that kept on breathing because of them. After the war, they went home, back to ordinary lives, as if they had never done the extraordinary. Most never spoke a word about it, even on their deathbeds. But here now, we speak for them. They didn't ask for glory. They just wanted the world to keep spinning. And it did. And because they were there, quietly turning the wheel, they weren't supposed to be heroes. They were supposed to be safe, behind the lines, tending wounds, keeping spirits up. But war doesn't follow rules. And neither did the Japanese army. In early 1942, as Singapore burned under relentless bombardment, a group of Australian nurses stayed behind. Dozens of women, many in their 20s, made the impossible choice to stay with their patients instead of fleeing for their lives. One of them was Vivian Bullwinkle. She was kind, soft-spoken, and stubborn in the best way. When Japanese forces closed in on the city, she and 65 other nurses were ordered to evacuate. They boarded the SS Wiener Brook, believing it would carry them to safety. But safety never came. Japanese planes found the ship and tore it apart in the water. Vivian survived the sinking, clinging to wreckage, helping wounded men to shore on a remote beach called Banker Island. That's where the nightmare began. The nurses gathered with surviving soldiers, their white uniforms still soaked. In salt water, they raised a red cross flag. They thought it would protect them. Instead, Japanese soldiers arrived. The wounded men were executed. Then came the nurses. One by one, they were ordered into the sea and machine-gunned from behind. Vivian was hit. She fell. She pretended to be dead, floating in bloody water, holding her breath as bodies sank beside her. Hours passed before she dared to move. She survived, the only one. Captured and held as a prisoner of war for nearly 4 years, she never stopped nursing others, even when her own body was wasting away, even when her hands shook from hunger and trauma. She lived to tell the truth the world didn't want to hear, and in her voice echoed the silence of all the women who never came home. They were daughters of shepherds, seamstresses, schoolgirls. Some had never seen a city, others had never fired a weapon. But when the Germans came, burning villages, hanging fathers, taking brothers, something ancient awoke in them. They didn't run, they rose. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, the resistance wasn't just a movement, it was survival. And the women became warriors. They traded ribbons for rifles, their lullabies turned to battle cries. They smuggled ammunition beneath loaves of bread, passed secret messages stitched into hems, and when the moment came, they didn't hesitate to kill. One of them was Milja Marin. She was 17 when her village was destroyed. By 19, she led a partisan unit through the forests, striking German patrols in the dead of night. Her weapon, a stolen Mauser. Her reason, every name she couldn't forget. They were called flowers with fire in their hands. Because that's what they looked like. Young, beautiful, fierce, they would attack, vanish into the trees, and return hours later to tend the wounded. The Nazis feared them, called them fanatics, but they weren't fanatics. They were free in the purest, rawest sense. They fought not for conquest, but for dignity, for the right to exist, and many never lived to see that right. Some were captured and tortured. Others died in ambushes, buried where they fell. But those who survived carried the memory like a wound and a promise. History forgot their names, but the mountains still whisper them. And now, so will we. They flew in the dark. No headlights, no radios, no parachutes. Just the hum of a wooden plane and the weight of death in the cold night air. They were called the Night Witches, not by their own country, but by the German soldiers who feared them. Because when you heard the soft swoosh of canvas wings cutting through the sky like a broomstick, it meant you were already too late. These were young Soviet women. Some were still teenagers, and Stalin had given them a choice few thought real. Fight or fade, they chose to fight. Their planes were made of plywood and fabric, old crop dusters barely held together. No guns, no armor, not even radios. But they learned how to glide silently above enemy lines, kill the engine, and drop bombs with nothing but their heartbeat to guide them. The Germans called them witches because their attacks came without warning. No sound, no light, just explosions, then vanishing into the black. They flew 8 missions a night, night after night, crawling out of frozen cockpits with frostbitten fingers, changing into new uniforms stiff with blood and sweat. One of them was Nadezhda Popova. She lost her brother in the war. She buried her fear with him. At 19, she flew through flak storms so thick she couldn't see the moon. She was hit more than once. She kept flying. By the time the war ended, she had flown 850 missions. Not one of these women ever backed down. Not one of them ever broke, but when the medals were handed out, many were left behind. They weren't men. They weren't supposed to be legends, but they were. And in the silence above the Arctic skies, they still are. They signed up to fight for a country that didn't fight for them. They wore the same uniform, swore the same oath, endured the same war. But when they looked into the mirror of their nation, they saw a truth that cut deeper than any battlefield. They were black women in the US Army during World War II, and they were told they didn't belong. But they showed up anyway. One unit in particular would make history. Though most history books forget their name, the 88th Central Postal Directory Battalion. Nearly 1,000 black women deployed to Europe, tasked with a mission no one else could fix. The military's shattered mail system, mountains of letters, thousands of packages, entire warehouses choking in undelivered hope. Soldiers hadn't heard from home in months. Morale was collapsing. But to the generals, this was just clerical work. To the 88th, it was a lifeline. They worked around the clock in cold, rat-infested buildings, sorting, reading, delivering 6 million pieces of mail, 3 shifts a day. No errors, no excuses. They were met with hostility from white soldiers, from white officers, from their own damn government. But they didn't flinch, because they knew what they were really delivering wasn't just mail, it was memory, connection, love. When they marched in formation down the streets of Birmingham, England, the locals stopped and stared. Not because of their color, but because of their discipline, their grace, their pride. They didn't carry rifles, but they carried a message: we're here, we serve, we matter. And though their service was buried in silence for decades, now, finally, their voices are rising, because courage doesn't come in one shade. And these women wore theirs with fire. When we hear the word kamikaze, we picture a young man flying straight into death, wrapped in honor and desperation. But what we rarely hear are the stories of the women, because they were there too, not in the cockpits, but in the shadows of the same madness, fueling the planes, writing the final letters, preparing the dead. In the final, crumbling days of the Japanese Empire, as defeat loomed and hope curdled into fanaticism, young women were pulled into a war that had no future for them. Some were recruited, many were assigned. Their job, to serve death. Girls as young as 15 were drafted into the Patriotic Women's Association, trained not with weapons, but with doctrine. They were taught how to sew flight suits, how to bow to ashes, how to smile as they handed off the flags the pilots would carry to the grave. Some volunteered to become kamikazes. Yes, there were women who begged for a chance to fly and die for the emperor, and when denied, they didn't retreat. They lit themselves on fire, literally. A group of teenage girls from Okinawa, known as the Himeyuri, turned school basements into makeshift hospitals. When the US invaded, they were told to kill themselves before surrendering. Many did. It wasn't bravery they were given, it was expectation. It was the sharp blade of obedience pressed to the neck of girlhood, and yet in that silence, some resisted. Some hid soldiers, some whispered forbidden truths, some survived and carried a guilt that didn't belong to them. Their names were erased, their suffering dismissed. Even today, Japan struggles to face them. But they existed, not as symbols, not as ghosts, as girls with lives stolen by the machinery of war, and if we don't speak of them, who will? It was supposed to be suicide, a city already broken by 5 years of occupation, rising up with homemade grenades and barely enough bullets to last a week. But Warsaw didn't care. Warsaw rose, and at the heart of that uprising were the women, teenage girls in braids, school teachers, nurses, mothers. They took to the streets with fire in their eyes and nothing left to lose. They weren't just messengers, they were fighters, snipers, saboteurs. And when the Germans came back with tanks and flamethrowers, they didn't run, they stayed. Zofia was just 14. She learned to throw Molotov cocktails before she learned to kiss. She ran between burning buildings with bandages and bullets in her bag, ducking machine gun fire like it was rain. One night she crawled through a sewer pipe for hours to deliver a single message that saved dozens of trapped fighters. Behind her, people were screaming. Above her, the city was dying, but she kept moving. Then there was wonder, a resistance. Commander, captured, tortured. Her fingernails pulled out one by one. She never spoke a word, never gave up a name, not even her own. They say she sang a lullaby through broken teeth, just to defy the silence they tried to force on her. When the uprising was crushed, many women were slaughtered in mass executions. Others were sent to camps. Their names were burned with their bodies, and yet, somehow, their courage echoes in every cracked wall of Warsaw, in every surviving journal, in every freedom that Poland now breathes. They screamed, and the world did not listen, but we do, and we remember. They were born in the belly of the beast, raised under Nazi flags, taught to howl before they could read, promised a place in the 1,000-year Reich, as wives, mothers, breeders of soldiers. But not all of them bowed. Some betrayed that promise, and in doing so, they became enemies of their own blood. In the heart of Berlin, in cafes and universities, in quiet apartments filled with fear and flickering candlelight, German women began to resist Hitler, not with armies, but with whispers. They were called traitors, They called themselves free, their weapons, ink film, photographs, secrets. One group, led by a fearless young woman named Libertas Schulze-Boysen, smuggled intelligence to the Allies right under the nose of the Gestapo. She and her husband were part of what the Nazis would call the Red Orchestra, a web of spies, poets, students, even actresses, all feeding lifelines to those fighting the regime. Libertas carried microfilm in her gloves. She photographed deportation lists. She exposed the machinery of the Holocaust from the inside, knowing that if she were caught, death would be a mercy. Another woman, Mildred Harnack, American by birth, taught literature in Berlin by day and helped plan acts of sabotage. By night, she was arrested, beheaded. Her final words were, "I have loved Germany so much." They weren't spies in the way we imagine. They were wives who stopped dinners to hide fugitives. They were students who carved down with Hitler into desks. They were cicadas, fragile voices singing truth in a season ruled by silence. And one by one, those voices were crushed, but not all songs die. Some just go quiet until someone listens again, and now we listen. They arrived with clean uniforms, starched collars, and hearts full of purpose. But nothing could have prepared them for what waited just beyond the front. They were the American field nurses of World War II, and they didn't work in hospitals. They worked in hell, tents sagging with rain, mud ankle deep, the air thick with screams. They moved through the chaos with steady hands, tying off arteries, cleaning wounds filled with dirt and shrapnel, whispering comfort to boys who wouldn't live to see the sunrise. One nurse, Second Lieutenant Francis Slanger, wrote a letter to Stars and Stripes, a quiet thank you to the infantrymen who protected her unit. She never saw it published. That same night, a German shell ripped through the tent where she was resting. She died with her boots still on. These women carried more than bandages. They carried last words. They wrote letters for dying soldiers, scribbled, "Tell Mom I love her," with shaking fingers. They kissed foreheads smeared with blood, held hands that would never hold again, and somehow, in the middle of all this, there was still love. Not always romantic, though sometimes it was, but love in the purest sense, raw, human, aching. A kind of desperate tenderness that blooms only where death breathes down your neck. One nurse, Anna, remembered falling for a wounded lieutenant. He couldn't speak, his jaw shattered. But every day she came to him, read to him, stayed longer than she was supposed to. When he finally smiled, it was crooked, broken, and perfect. He died the next day. She kept his dog tag. These women weren't background. They were the soul of every battlefield. And long after the war ended, they could still hear the screams, still feel the warmth of a fading pulse in their palms. Because some wounds don't bleed. They echo. They arrived with numbers sewn to their chests, their hair shaved, their names stolen. They were no longer daughters, mothers, lovers, or students. They were just prisoners, flesh to be worked, broken, erased. But even behind the barbed wire of places like Dachau, Ravensbrück, and Auschwitz, even in the belly of the darkest machine ever built by men, women fought to stay human. They hid scraps of bread under their sleeves, whispered songs from childhood when the silence became too loud. They used stolen thread to sew prayers into the lining of their skirts. And when one fell, the others lifted her, because if they didn't, no one would. Some became nurses inside. The camps, not by training but by instinct, they wrapped wounds with rags, placed cold hands on burning foreheads. They held the dying and told them they were loved, even if it was a lie. Sometimes a lie is the only mercy left. One woman, Ella, remembered watching her best friend be selected for transport. She never saw her again. That night, she stole a pencil stub from a guard's desk and carved her friend's name into the wall of their barrack. She did it again the next night, and the next, until the wall became a grave of memory. There were also women who resisted with quiet fire. They smuggled gunpowder in their dresses from the munitions factory, grain by grain. enough to blow up part of a crematorium at Auschwitz. They were beaten, tortured, hanged, but they chose defiance. We often say they were victims, and yes, they suffered beyond words, but they were also warriors in the most impossible sense. They refused to let their souls die. The world forgot them because they didn't die with guns in hand. They died on their feet or on their knees, but never empty. They left behind no medals, only silence. And now that silence is over. She wasn't supposed to fly, not in war, not in uniform, not as a woman, but Nadine knew the sky like it was part of her body. And when the world caught fire, she didn't ask for permission. She climbed into the cockpit. Nadine L. was one of the few French women pilots trained before the war. When the Germans invaded, she watched her country crumble in weeks. She could have fled, could have waited for peace to return. Instead, she joined the resistance and used her plane, a rickety old courier craft, to do the unthinkable. She flew alone at night, through hostile airspace, carrying messages, medicine, sometimes even people. No guns, no escort, just a compass, a prayer and nerves made of steel. The sky became her battlefield. There were missions where she flew so low she could see the flicker of Nazi searchlights moving across the fields. Once her engines sputtered near the Belgian border, she landed in the dark, alone, not knowing if she'd take off again or be shot where she stood. She always got back in. On what would be her final mission, Nadine was carrying intelligence, so vital it could shift the Allies' timing in occupied France. She didn't tell anyone goodbye. She just took off. She never landed. Some say she was shot down near the Ardennes. Others believe she made it across enemy lines and was captured, executed in silence. No wreckage, no grave, no closure. Only wind and sky and memory. But for those she flew for, the wounded, the hidden, the hunted, Nadine was not just a pilot, she was salvation. She may have vanished from the sky that night, but she never fell, because when courage takes flight, it leaves a trail that no war can erase. The war ended with parades, with headlines, with medals pinned to men's chests and flags waving like promises. The world exhaled, victory was declared. But for the women who had fought, in shadows, in silence, in blood, there was no parade. They went home to kitchens that hadn't changed, to neighbors who hadn't known, to governments that handed them sewing needles instead of recognition. No speeches, no statues, just forgetfulness. Many were told to keep quiet. You did your part. Now let the men have their glory. Some didn't even tell their children what they had done. Decades passed, with their heroism locked behind the walls of memory. Because who would believe them? Who would care? Lisa, the spy, lived a quiet life in England. Her wartime files were classified for 50 years. Joan, the codebreaker, watched her male colleagues be celebrated while she faded into obscurity. Vivian, the sole nurse survivor, gave speeches, but always carried the weight of the women who died beside her on that beach. Some died in poverty, some lived with trauma that had no name. Some, like Nadine, were never found. But still, they endured. They raised families, taught classrooms, built careers. They moved through the world not as victims, but as women who had once held history in their hands and been told to drop it. Yet history has a pulse. And slowly, quietly, the truth began to rise. Today, their names are being unearthed, their stories retold, their courage restored to its rightful place. They didn't fight for glory, they fought for life, for each other, for a future they knew they might never see, but believed in anyway. And now we see it. Because the day after war ends isn't about parades, it's about remembering who paid the price for peace. They didn't ask to be remembered. They didn't storm beaches for applause. They didn't bleed in bunkers to become legends. They fought because someone had to, because silence, obedience, invisibility, those were the real enemies. And yet, they were forgotten anyway. But not entirely, not forever. Because now we speak their names. We tell their stories not as side notes in a man's war, but as the heartbeat of a history that was never whole without them. Their legacy isn't in statues. It's in the woman who leads a battalion today and knows she belongs there. It's in the nurse who touches a wound with tenderness and steel. It's in the coder, the pilot, the spy, the fighter, who all walk through doors first cracked, opened by hands that history tried to erase. These women didn't disappear. They became us. And now that we've heard them, really heard them, we carry something we didn't before. Not just facts, not just names, but duty. Because remembering them isn't nostalgia. It's resistance. To forget is to lose them all, over again, but to speak their stories aloud, to pass them on with tears in our eyes and fire in our chest. That is how we keep them alive. So if this moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it, speak it, comment their names. Make sure the world knows they were never just women, they were warriors, and they will never be forgotten again. And now you know. You've seen the courage, you've heard the silence. You've felt the weight of the stories that were never supposed to reach you. But this was just the beginning, because the truth is still out there. There are still names missing, still women who fought and are waiting to be remembered. So stay sharp, pay attention, because the next erased voice might be closer than you think. And if this moved you even a little, then don't walk away like nothing happened. Like this video, share it. Comment a name that should never be forgotten, and above all, subscribe so you're here when the next untold story comes to light. We're not just remembering history, we're fixing it together. See you in the next one.